First time I heard about EMDR was in Israel in 1989. And I was giving a talk in Jerusalem, and I heard somebody had heard this Francine Shapiro person giving a talk at some other university, and they said that wiggling your fingers in front of people's eyes would really help people, and they were impressed. And I said, I've never heard anything as stupid and silly as that, and dismissed it for many years. So then one of my patients who I'd struggled with went to EMDR training because she was a PhD psychologist, and resolved something during her training that we had worked on for 4 years. Not only that, but then she wondered if I'd be willing to give her a refund.
Because of just the necessity of nothing else working, I went away for the training, still somewhat skeptical, and I returned, and the first soldier that I used EMDR with, I treated the soldier at 2 sessions, and on the 3rd session I went out in my waiting room and his wife was out there. And the wife said, I just wanted to stop by and thank you. I don't know what you're doing with my husband, but I want to tell you whatever it is, it's working. I have my husband back the way he was before he deployed to Iraq. And like I say, I've been doing therapy for many years, and there are very few spouses who stop by to thank me for the results of therapy, but I have this type of feedback from the very first session.
At that time, I was on the editorial board of the Journal of Traumatic Stress, and in 1989 they published Shapiro's introduction to EMDR, which was based on some research she had done with it. I had never heard of her. I had never heard of this new therapy she was talking about. This was the first. I had not been a reviewer for her article, but when I saw it in our journal, my immediate reaction was this was hogwash. And I had no idea how getting somebody to move their eyes back and forth while they thought about their trauma experience was going to do anything. I called the editor. I called him up, and I remember the conversation. I asked him if he had read this Shapiro article. He says, oh, yes. What do you think of it? And I said, well, either we're the victims of a hoax or our reviewers missed some major flaw in the methodology. And he said, no, this is for real.
It was 1989, and I was being trained to utilize hypnosis in behavioral medicine. And at that time, a colleague was actually coming into my office to do some supervision. He was my consultant. And one day he walks in and he tosses this paper at me. And the first thing I see is that it's published in Palo Alto, so being, typically East Coast bigoted, my first reaction was, why would I read anything that comes out of Palo Alto? Because it's usually crazy. And he said, no, you should take a look at this. It's weird, but there's something to it. So at that point, my seat was actually where those books were, and what I did is, rather than throw it in the garbage, which I knew not to, I tossed it. And it ended up on the top shelf up there, and that was it. And around that time, a colleague of mine had referred a woman who ran a fast food place, like a McDonald's and such, had been robbed twice, pistol whipped, really terrible PTSD. And I was treating her with hypnosis, and it was actually working pretty well. And it was one of those things where you use trance logically. You tell somebody, well, what are the odds of you getting robbed again since you've been robbed twice? And as she's coming in for her last session, this place wasn't well protected. She comes in, with a big bruise on her face. She just got robbed again, and now she tells me what I can do with my trance logic. And she was going to quit, and she had actually sort of worked herself up. The next step would have been corporate. So I remember thinking about that paper, and I said to her, I'll write you a note. You don't have to go to work for a week. And I told her, you're going to come in here, and I'm going to be sitting there with a clipboard and just waving my fingers around like an idiot. And it's supposed to be a very new technique that should be very useful. And she sort of rolled her eyes, and she came in. And so I'm sitting there I'd read a few times the EMD protocol, and, waving my hands around for 24 seconds, asking her what she noticed. And 90 minutes later, she is symptom-free.
Well, it actually started about 10 years previous, back in the late 70s. I got cancer, and that shifted my attention from English literature, which I was doing at the time, to mind-body. And so I started using my mind and body as a laboratory, you see, just being observant of what was happening. And so took every workshop I could think of, you know, that type of thing. And then one day I was walking along and I noticed that some disturbing thoughts I was having was suddenly disappearing. And when I went to bring them back, they just didn't have the same charge anymore. And it was interesting to me because it's the kind of thought that you usually have to engage in to get it to shift. But I hadn't done anything deliberately. So I was very curious and kept paying attention and noticed that when that kind of thought came up, my eyes started moving very rapidly in a certain way. And I noticed the thought shifting from my mind. And then when I brought it back, it just didn't have the same charge. So I was wondering, that's curious. Let me see if it would work deliberately. So I brought up something bothering me, moved my eyes in the same way, and noticed the same thing happening. And after experimenting on myself a bit, I wanted to see if it could work for anyone else. So I gathered every warm body I could lay my hands on and said, "What's anything troubling you?" And everyone had something, right? So they brought up the thing that was bothering them, and I showed them how my eyes had moved and asked them to do the same thing, and found that most people didn't have the muscle control to do it. So I said, okay, follow my fingers with your eyes, and I led their eyes in doing the same thing. And I found that the same kind of shift would often occur, and sometimes it wouldn't, and if I added certain things, it would. And so I developed a procedure around what seemed to be the effect of the eye movement.
As she began to see that the past does have something to do with EMDR, which a lot of cognitive behavioral people didn't care for. It's like, let's just talk about the present. Well, the beauty of EMDR also is that it has been a showcase to seeing what's really there, not what did Dr. So-and-so say, because that's been the problem with psych. Psych has always been, it's almost been like a Talmudic science. You know, this one says this one says this, I was trained by this one, now I see through his or her eyes. With EMDR, even though Francine began with, let's deal with the present, it was desensitization, she began to see that people were free associating. And so she included that in. Once you bring that in, it became reprocessing.
The thoughts that you have at the moment of the trauma themselves become a traumatic trigger and an organizing factor. And so, what were you thinking? You dumb idiot. Huh? Or I knew it was going to happen, or I deserved it. And these cognitions are in and of themselves pieces of the traumatic kernels, as Pierre Genet would have called them. And they need to be processed also. So Francine really hit on really the important elements to my mind. And certainly I would not say, oh, she missed this or she missed that. No, she got it right.
Keith and Jeremy, they're identical twins. They lived together in New York, spent their whole lives together. The three of us were best friends. Where I went, they went. You know, that's how it was our whole lives. We had like people used to think that we were triplets, even though they were the twins. Like we were always did the same things. I went to school, Pitt. They followed. Like we always had a bond. A special bond. I mean, we're as close could be. And next thing I knew, I woke up. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was standing in the middle of a street in New York City. In a pitch dark. I blacked out. I don't remember what happened, or where I was, or what I was doing. I was in a different world. And I started running. I picked up my cell phone. Picked it up, and I'm looking at it. And it's not, like, the battery's done. There was no battery left in it. Never in my life did I have a time when I didn't have battery in my phone. never happened. My phone has never run out of battery. That night it did. And I remember I was running through this, and so I know what way to call anyone. My first thought was, oh my God, where are Keith and Jeremy? That was my first thought. And I remember I'm running through the streets, yelling, Keith, Jeremy. I was screaming for them. I didn't know where I was, and I ran. And at one point I stopped running, and I looked up, and I don't know, I found their apartment. My sister was there. I had walked down the steps at the moment that she just got there. I opened the door up, and Holly says, she starts crying and says, Keith's hurt. I said, yeah. I said, what? And I started screaming. I said, what are you talking about? He's hurt. And she said he fell. And he fell and hit his head. So November 24th, he laid in a coma. Like, she's someone you love more than anything else in the world. Like, you see him laying in the hospital. Surreal. Yeah. Anyway, the swelling in his brain never went down, kept getting worse. And then on November 27th, in the afternoon, is when they pronounced him brain dead. I spent a lot of time blaming myself. Like, why wasn't I there? You know, like I was always a strong one and I could help and protect them. Yeah, it was a dark place. Extremely dark place. I don't know. I think unless you've not been in a place like that, you don't know. Because honestly, I didn't think a place like that existed.
And that first visit was very difficult for him, more difficult probably than most every other patient I can ever think of. When he would come into session, his appearance was disheveled. He would have a hard time even keeping up with normal showering and stuff. He would maybe shower every other day or third day or whatever because he just was so depressed.
I was spiraling fast, gained 60 pounds, 50, 60 pounds. I didn't want to get up. I didn't even want to get up. One of my huge problems was the thoughts I was thinking, the things that I could have done differently. Or that I still wanted to change, from going, like where we went that night, from Keith being in the hospital room, from why wasn't I with him, and those thoughts were constantly being it was like there was a tape cassette in my head. The tape finished up, the rewind button was hit, and then hit play again. We're going through it again. And I can't speak for anyone else in my family, but or anyone else in this world who was lost. But I bet their tape plays too, like that. And I didn't think it would ever stop playing. And I needed help. I needed it.
I started to introduce to him the idea of trying this relatively new therapy. I mean, it's been around for quite some time now, but Jason hadn't heard of it yet. Mm-hmm. And when most people hear it for the first time, they are a little taken aback because it seems so unique, and it is in many ways, but it does seem to hold great promise for most people. Using EMDR, you literally see the person changing before your eyes.
I would stop every so often, and Jerry would say, "What are you thinking now?" And then I would tell him exactly what I'm thinking. From beautiful things to sad things. I'd have tears and I'd have laughter. But I think without those tears and without the laughter combined, I don't think it would have been as. I don't think it would have been the same. I thought too it was beautiful. When I compare myself now with the Jason that I was just over 2.5 years ago, I'm not even I'm not the same person.
He probably finds himself in a better place today than even before his brother died, because he was in a good place then. I mean, you could hear how he talks about the bond that him and his brothers shared, and I think that's a tribute to his ability to be willing to look at the hurt and the grief and move beyond it through EMDR.
I thank him every time I see him, I think, because what he's done for me has been saved me.
When we experience a threat, it enters our system through our senses. That's what gives us our own perception of things. Why 4 people could see the same experience and have 4 different stories. Once it enters the system and the filter accepts it, it goes to a stop sign. This is the amygdala. But the stop sign's purpose is to label information as dangerous or non-dangerous. If the stop sign says, you're dangerous, then what it does is it freezes the experience into a sheet of glass. Then that big sheet of glass with this entire experience gets thrown into this holding tank. When it's in this holding tank, it shatters into 1,000,000 bits. Because a big piece of glass is too hard for it to be processed in the brain. So we've got to break it down real quickly. So it gets in there and it shatters. Which is why sometimes that experience of that strobe effect in the middle of a traumatic experience happens, where it almost feels like it's disconnected, but it's in order. It's disconnected because of all these little pieces breaking apart. These fragments don't leave quickly. Like if it were non-dangerous information, it would have been cleared out after the experience. Because it was a threat, because it was dangerous, these get stuck in here.
Once you have that kind of a problem, now you lose basically what's called binding. You lose the linkage ability to integrate things. So if you look, for instance, at type 1 PTSD, what are the symptoms? You have, everything is fragmented. You walk into a place that reminds you of something, and now you have a flashback, but it's not like the memory of, ooh, that takes me back, which is still integrated. You have that fragment of a flashback, and it can't link to memory, which would tell you that flashback has to do with last week or 2 years ago. You have somatosensory disintegration. People have all of these feelings and experiences. Memory becomes fragmented and not linked, because at that point, your brain cannot tell you that experience you're having is a memory. So basically, this is how things work, and this is how things go wrong. Now, EMDR, in those cases, repairs all of this. What we know today from enough research is that sensory stimulation causes first what's called like an orienting response, and the system in the body, the parasympathetic system that slows us down, is engaged. So at that point, being exposed to the trauma is no longer as awful as regular exposure therapy. And then the sensory stimulation in the brain begins to cause a bunch of chain reactions. One of them is that it activates a number of systems and eventually activates the thalamus. There already you now begin to repair all this kind of fragmentation. What also happens from that same kind of an orienting response is that it seems to be able to engage a REM system from dream sleep, and it seems to activate that kind of a system while we're awake.
So what happens with the EMDR is we tap into that inner mechanism that the brain has that would ordinarily allow those connections to be made, but it can't. It's stuck. And we're able to take the person further than they can naturally go. But it's still the brain's, their own brain's ability to do it that's being kept dynamic. And so it's not that the therapist has to supply all of the answers, it's that they're assisting the client for their own brain to stay dynamic, to move it to the resolution.
EMDR doesn't seem to care whether this took place yesterday or 50 years ago. And I've worked with veterans who went ashore at Normandy, all the way up through kids coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and other unhappy places. And it's like the brain doesn't care that this was a half century ago. As far as the brain is concerned, this is current events. This is something that it's wrestling with right now.
If you've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. I'll see that image for the rest of my life, okay? That means I'm stuck in flashback, and that is a loss of hope. But what happens is when you do EMDR, the image gets further and further away, and the anxiety that it brings goes down and down and down, and you can all of a sudden you feel it's in the past, I did the best I could, I can go on with my life. That's hope.
Another component of EMDR that's significant and I find to be very helpful is the therapist isn't necessarily doing anything to you to change. It's an internal process. It's an individual and internal process that the therapist is there to help you maneuver through.
That cannot be contained, that cannot be caged, that cannot be understood, that cannot be really processed very much works with. But something happens when you do EMDR that allows certain memories to be processed and to be laid to rest. And that is something that I think people don't nearly talk about enough.
Yeah, the brain is a remarkable system. Even though we think that the brain doesn't have a lot of plasticity, ability to sort of rewire itself, it really does, even in the adult, have significant capabilities in that regard.
When the connections are made, what's really happening is what's useful is learned and what's not useful is being let go. And it's so when we're looking at those, for instance, who have been raped, I have a client, for instance, who started out feeling, I'm terrible, I'm shameful, I'm a whore. At the end of the treatment, she's recognizing the shame is his. It's not mine. I'm a strong, resilient woman. What we often see is people take these terrible experiences and feel stronger from it, and also a sense of, I want to make it better for others so others know that they don't have to suffer from this. And so they do change their lives.
We're 30 minutes outside of Baltimore in the community where Antoine and Tony grew up. There was no furniture in the home. 5 kids slept on one mattress that was on the floor. And they come from a family of 8 to 11 children. We don't know the exact number, and they all lived in this house. Very impoverished. Didn't eat. From the reports that we received, social services would come and the boys would be eating out the trash, no clothes, ringworms on their body. So they didn't even know when they were going to eat, none of the children. So, and the mom was out in this area, which is very drug infested, searching for the next high or the next alcohol fix.
My other house, somebody got killed, and I was pretty scared about it. They left me in the house.
They left you in the house?
Alone.
All alone, okay.
Because he was asleep, and we heard some glass breaking, because we have glass for our door, and then my mom saw a man with a gun in his hand pointing down, and then she was scared and she got my hand and ran out the door to the next door neighbor's house.
There was another young man in the house who was the boyfriend of a daughter, Antoine's sister, and he was shot in the head, died immediately. So I think that finally said enough.
If I'm scared, she can help me not be scared. Like when I do this, she helped me get my feelings out and stuff, and help me notice that nothing's gonna happen to me because I'm in a good family, I'm in a good neighborhood and stuff.
So what EMDR does is it processes out those unhealed experiences, those hot experiences that are pushing our emotions, are pushing our behaviors, are pushing our beliefs, are pushing our sense of self. And it's not about the present, it's really about the past. The stuff gets processed from the past, and the present is a whole different place. You're not seeing it with those negative lenses anymore, you see, because it's not coming up automatically. And that's what EMDR is about. It's about liberating the person from the past stuff so they can be happy in the present.